In this video, we will explore the history of children's literature and discuss some of the different functions that the genre has provided. We'll review 5 major functions that most children's literature tends to perform, and you'll want to keep these in mind throughout the semester as we look at different genres. The first that we'll examine is formal education, or teaching students the reading, writing, and arithmetic skills that they would need in the classroom. The second is practical instruction, or literature that teaches children about the world around them, focuses on things like nature or agriculture. Then we'll look at literature that offers moral guidance, teaches children the should and should nots, as well as social and cultural reinforcement, or literature that reinforces specific social norms. These 4 functions are all didactic in nature. In other words, they teach or instruct. And we often associate these forms with pedantic or preachy literature today. But as you will learn, even recent children's literature is built on this foundation of didactic lessons. And finally, we'll examine children's literature as a form of entertainment. Let's begin by examining formal education. Hornbooks are one of the earliest forms of children's literature. They were on slates or wooden plaques, kind of like the one that you see here, and they date back to the medieval period. They help students, usually male students because of the time period, to master the alphabet and the Lord's Prayer, which you'll see is listed down there below. Oftentimes, these hornbooks were in Latin because students in the medieval period were taught Latin and Greek as well. The next we'll examine is primers, or readers, like the one that you see here. These taught spelling and vocabulary using short stories. And finally, we have here Anna Barbauld's Lessons for Children, which educated students about the basic structures like days of the week or names of the month. Next, we'll look at practical instruction. We have an excerpt here from Anna Barbauld's Lessons for Children, so let's go ahead and read that now. Corn makes bread. Corn grows in the fields. Grass grows in the fields. Cows eat grass, and sheep eat grass, and horses eat grass. Little boys do not eat grass. No, they eat bread and milk. Okay, so we can see here that this is providing readers lessons about the world around them. This kind of practical literature often focuses on animals or the nature or the body. And in fact, we see these lessons being taught in a lot of recent children's literature as well. Next, we'll look at literature that offers moral guidance. And if you look at the top of this page, you'll probably be familiar with the title, Mother Goose's Melody, or Mother Goose's Nursery Rhymes, as we know them today. Now, this text was taken from a 1791 edition of the book. And in the 18th century, the lowercase letter s was often printed as an F. So as we read this text above, you'll want to make that mental conversion. Let's begin now. There was an old woman lived under a hill, and if she isn't gone, she lives there still. Now, as the text below tells us, this is a self-evident proposition. She lived under the hill, and if she's not gone, then she still lives there. Nobody will presume to contradict this. In other words, this text is conveying a principle of logic. It educates, so it's probably providing some of that formal education. But if we look on the other side of the page, this text is doing something a little bit different. So let's look at Plato's song. Ding dong bell, the cat is in the well. Who put her in? Little Johnny Green. What a naughty boy was that to drown poor Pussycat, who never did any harm and killed the mice in his father's barn. You'll notice at the bottom of the page that we have a maxim that says, he that injures one threatens 100. Now this is a kind of moral lesson that basically reminds readers that there are larger consequences for their actions, so that if they harm one thing, they might be harming several. So it's offering moral guidance. Now we'll look at texts that reinforce cultural norms. So we have here the New England Primer. This was one of the most widely circulated school books in America during the 17th and 18th century. And as you can see, it provided a formal education. It taught students the ABCs. This is probably a genre that you're familiar with, these kind of alphabet books where we have a letter and a picture and a nice little catchy rhyme to help students remember what kinds of words that letter begins. Now, you're probably used to seeing these as A is for apple, B is for boy, C is for cat. But we have something a little bit different here. Instead, we have, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. Heaven to find, the Bible mind. Christ crucified, for sinners died. So we have these rhymes that are easy to remember, but they're also reinforcing Puritan theology. We have selections within this text from the King James Bible and from a couple of different catechisms. Students are reminded of their biblical lessons as they're learning their ABCs. You may recognize one of the most popular verses that came out of this text. Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray thee, Lord, my soul to keep, and if I die before I wake, I pray thee, Lord, my soul to take. This is still a very popular prayer that children read before they go to bed. Now we'll examine social reinforcement. I'm going to give you a minute to read through this page on your own. Begin now. I'll give you a few more seconds. So, what lessons about society does this excerpt teach? The first one, I think, is everyone must work. And there are several other principles, social principles, that it reinforces as well. Things like hard work earns money. Boys belong outside. Good children are rewarded with increased responsibility, so the boy gets a garden if he's good. It's necessary to separate the domestic from the wild. So this is looking at some principles of nature. As well as growth requires careful tending. These are all social principles that the text is reinforcing. Now we'll switch to lessons that entertain. This is a text, a little pretty pocketbook from the 18th century, and John J. Newbery was the author. Now you might recognize that name because the Newbery Medal, which is one of the most popular awards for children's books now, is named after him. And part of the reason for that is that he really was one of the founders of this idea that lessons should also be entertaining. So he thinks about instruction with delight and instruction and amusement. You can see that in the title of this page here. Now, he also introduced a new element, which I like to think of kind of as McDonald's Happy Meal toys. When parents bought this book for the children, they also received a ball if it was for a boy and a pincushion if it was for a girl. Now, these toys were used to reinforce moral lessons. The ball on one side was black and on the other side was red, same thing with the pincushion. And parents were given 10 pins that they could stick in either the ball or the cushion. And if the children would get a letter that you can see written about on this title page here from Jack the Giant Killer, in which Jack tells children that if they're good, they'll get a pin on the red side of the ball, and if they're bad, they'll get a pin on the black side of the ball. Now, if they get 10 pins on the red side, they get a penny as a reward. But if they get 10 pins on the black side, they get a whipping. So Newbery really founded this idea of teaching by way of diversion. He made the lessons more entertaining, used things like Jack the Giant Killer and fiction to make the lessons more fun for the children, and also had some moral reinforcement involved. So he's teaching through games, essentially. At the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, there was a shift away from thinking about children's literature as lessons that could entertain to emphasizing the entertainment component. So there's a shift from didacticism to enjoyment, from explicit lessons to implicit lessons. And your major job throughout this course is going to be uncovering those implicit lessons that are embedded within the text that we read, but are not necessarily explicitly stated. So we can see an example of this with Beatrix Potter's Peter Rabbit. I'm going to go ahead and just read you this quick excerpt now. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him because she was so glad to see that he found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the pocket handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling with the bunches of herbs and the rabbit tobacco. Now, this is a work of fiction. It's an entertaining story. But it does still have some implicit lessons embedded within it. So what kind of lessons can we uncover from this picture in this text? Well, the first I can see is some practical instruction. So we learn some things about the world. Rabbits live in dens, as we can see in this image, and they eat vegetables. We also, of course, have formal education. This text is teaching basic reading skills and some complex vocabulary. Readers are encouraged to transition from just looking at the pictures in a picture book to actually being able to read the text itself. It also teaches some moral lessons. So it sort of cautions children that they should keep track of their belongings, unlike Peter here. It also suggests that good mothers are forgiving, and says that teamwork and family are important. Cottontail and Peter are working together. And finally, we have some social reinforcement. For instance, the idea that women are responsible for domestic matters, like cooking and caretaking. Mrs. Rabbit is the one who's stringing up the onions and hanging them from the kitchen ceiling. In the picture, we see her taking care of the children as well. And finally, there's the idea that tenants are dependent on landowners for support. Now, this is one that you might not see unless you're familiar with the text as a whole, because we know that the Rabbit family here is living on McGregor's garden, and Peter has gone and stolen some vegetables from Mr. McGregor and brought them back to the house. So that's kind of that idea that the gardener, the person who's owning the lands, is providing for the people who are living on it, and that they're codependent. So the lesson that I would really like for you to take away from this presentation is that even though the stories we read will be entertaining, they are based on these same kind of didactic functions and have lessons embedded within them. So throughout the semester, we'll analyze the different parts of the stories to see how they work. We'll uncover the implicit messages that they're conveying to children, and we'll discuss the significance of those messages. We'll also look at how lessons in our conceptions of childhood have changed over time. And finally, we'll think about the role that those implicit lessons should take when we're considering which literature we should choose for children, as well as how we evaluate children's literature. That's all for now.